Very welcome. Oops.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to click continue here. There we go. Okay. So, well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to do this. And I have actually been collecting all facets of Falkland Islands for more years than I like to think now. I particularly like postal history, and I have a special love for postcards, which I think most of you, if you've watched the Upland Goose over the years, it seems that whenever I appear there, there's a postcard involved. I actually got first started back with postcards way back in the, I guess, late 70s, early 80s. It wasn't Falklands postcards at all, but some Argentina postcards. I was sending photocopies to Jeremy Howitt when he was in Argentina working with a postcard dealer there, putting together catalogs on certain publishers. And then, of course, Henry Hayburn's book came out, and I thought, my goodness, I have to find every one of those. So the hunt was then on, and I was fortunate enough in the year 2000 to come to a study group meeting. And Marjorie Wharton, of course, was a big postcard collector and aficionado. And she brought two of her binders filled with postcards for me to kind of drool over. And that continued that thirst to find more postcards. So here I am today talking a bit about postcards, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. I call this a visual history. And actually, I would say it's more of a visual history, a retrospective, if you will, but also kind of an oral history. I particularly like postcards that have been sent through the mails or at least written on in some manner. And often the stories that they tell are very, very interesting as well. So with that, Mike, let's move to the next slide. So this next slide, actually two of the same postcard, same view, same series, but one, the colorized version. That second series in the Hayburn book, a number of those cards have been seen in color as well. Most are not in color, but occasionally you see one in color. But that's not the real purpose for showing these two. I wanted to talk a bit about the perils of shipping to the Falkland Islands. And both of these cards illustrate that. The one on the left, and this was said in, I believe, 1907. And the quote, it's in French, but the quote is, about 22 ships are present. There are 19 damaged, which gives you a little bit of an idea of how many of them came limping into the harbor. And on the second, even a little more dramatic, this card was written by a crew member on the SV Beacon Rock. And we have been off Cape Horn for 5 weeks and have put back for repairs. Can you imagine 5 weeks trying to get around the Horn? The Beacon Rock was bound for Victoria, BC. And she put into Stanley in September of 1905 and didn't leave until January of 1906. And I should say that give my thanks to the shipping records that are all now online. It's made the research, for those that like to do research, just wonderful. And I'm one that does like to research. But this pretty dramatically illustrates the problems that they had with the waters, and particularly getting around the Cape. Next slide, please, Mike. Whoops, back one slide, please. There we go. Just a couple of things briefly on these two cards. An 1899 view that was published of laying the foundation stone at St. Mary's Chapel. And I've always liked this card. There's a lot of people in it, and you don't see a lot of cards with a lot of people. One of the things about the early cards is that they really did show off the sort of the social history as well as the visual history. And, you know, today's modern postcards, I guess a phrase that you hear sometimes, can't hold a candle to the old postcards, in my view. And that view is one of those. And in fact, Henry Hayburn refers to it, as you can see below, as a turn of the century of who is and who's to be in the Falkland Islands. The second card, a fairly common view of general view of Stanley, but what caught my eye on this one is that it said in French, with compliments of the doctor, E.T. Bourne. E.T. Bourne was the colonial surgeon in the Falkland Islands at this time. And he also served as a postmaster at Fox Bay for a short time, as did most of the doctors at that time. And this card that he sent to Italy, I don't know whether it was a regular correspondent of his or just somebody who was trying to get a postcard from the Falkland Islands. It's amazing how many early postcards and letters are requests for stamps and postcards. It's the collecting interest has gone on forever, I guess. Next slide, please, Mike. We've all seen a lot of John Rowan over the years, the last U.S. consul from the United States to Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. And I tried to pick a couple of things that we've not seen before. A photograph on the left that I received when I was in communication a number of years ago with John Rowan's granddaughter. And here's a picture of him with his grandson, Louis Felton. If you recall from the articles and those things that have been written, and most recently the articles from Malcolm, John Rowan's daughter, Winifred, married Jack Felton, and this is their son, Louis. And from the looks of the attire, I'm guessing this might have been the day of the baptism. It looks kind of like a baptismal gown to me. On the right, I just show one of the many cards that I've been able to find over the years written by John Rowan. This is one I kind of looked through past publications. I don't think we've shown this one. A view of the cathedral before the tower was built. And in his usual fashion, John Rowan points out that the cathedral cost £55,000 to erect, and that the tower is now added. And he says he will send one with the tower at a later date. This card was sent to his brother-in-law in Iowa. And at the very bottom of this card, a little kind of poignant, Mrs. Rowan has been gone for nearly a year. I am lonely. So apparently she was back home in Iowa visiting the family. Next card, please. Again, early years, just briefly a little bit more on John Rowan. I'm not sure if all of you realize that when he left Stanley, he actually served a term as U.S. consul in Punta Arenas, Chile. And on the left is a card that he sent to his daughter in Iowa from Punta Arenas, a view of the Magellans, the Straits of Magellan. And you probably can't see it, but on the very bottom left edge of that card that shows the stamps, you'll see the name Adolfo Quasny. He was a pretty prolific publisher of Chile postcards, particularly Punta Arenas, but he did do a series of Falkland Islands postcards as well. And if all of you that have Henry Hayburn's book, I'm sure you've seen it. There's, I think, 3 or 4 cards in the set. And the card on the right is a card, incoming card, the only one I've ever seen that he sent to the Falklands. It's addressed to William Biggs, the grandfather of Madge Biggs. And it's a St. Patrick's Day card. He loved St. Patrick's Day. He was from Ireland. And he just says, greetings from your old friend, J.E. Rowan, love to all. And he was getting quite a bit on in age at this point. I think he passed away in 1914. So I don't know that people had realized this information about him. Mike, next slide, please. Also in the early years, I've included Carl Scottsburg, you know, as he was a member of the Nordenskjöld Swedish South Polar expedition. And he came back in 1907-9 for the Swedish Magellanian expedition. And while in the Falklands, he took a number of postcards, a number of photographs. And here are two of them. One of the lighthouse, Cape Pembroke Lighthouse, and on the right, West Point Island. And in his text, he mentions, and I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but kind of on the left side of the hills, there's a little white dot. And he explains in his message that the white dot is smoke from the fire that they set to indicate that there's mail to be picked up. So when apparently the coastal steamer or whatever would be passing by, they would stop and pick up the mail. And again, back to the card on the left, you'll see the Swedish Magellanian expedition cachet that was applied to the card. And it was applied to the other card as well. Both these cards have had their stamps removed, as was usual with the cards that Scottsburg sent back home to Sweden. And also these were sent, I believe, to his fiancée in Finland. Next card, please, or next slide, please, Mike. An interesting card, this one sent to Carl Scottsburg in between the years from when he was first on the Antarctic expedition and before he returned for the Magellanian expedition. Must have been a friend of his, but it's a card sent to him. Apparently somebody who did not particularly want to go down to the ice like the others did, because he says it was about 5 or 6 years ago that you were on your way to the ice with a great big ugh after that. Again, an example of how perilous the waters were. He explains in this card that they've two disabled vessels here, one with the foremast completely gone, and he adds on there, killed a man at sea when it fell. Again, looked at the archives, and this was the Dora, and she in the archive says the Dora came in December 12th to Stanley, limping into Stanley in distress with the foremast gone. So that surely must be the same ship. Again, next slide, please, Mike. Whoops, back one, please.
It's done that twice.
He's got a fast finger. One more back. There we go. Oh, one
No,
forward.
it's not. I'm pressing it once, I can assure you.
Gotcha, there we go. So we'll move into the warriors. Everyone knows all about the Battle of Coronel and the Battle of the Falkland Islands. I just thought I would show two postcards from a fine series of photo postcards. There's about 6 or 7 in the series that point out a couple of scenes from this. The first card I find particularly moving. Who at the time knew that when this postcard was taken and the photo on October 20th of 14 all of the sailors from the Good Hope on shore leave in the Falklands, that less than 2 weeks later that she'd be lost with all hands in the Battle of Coronel. Really quite a moving postcard. There's a couple of other views with sailors ashore, and in all of them you can see the Samson, and here I think that's the stack of the Samson offshore there, but they're all very moving. And on the right, just one of the cards that have been shown depicting the funeral of those that were killed in the battle. This one was mailed by Clovis McGill. I think many people have got something from Clovis in their collections. He was quite a correspondent. And on the back of this one, he replies, I do not collect postcards. So he was pretty definitive about that. Next slide, Mike. Here's an example. We've seen a lot of these. An example of the past censor HMS Kent, a view of the Kent on the right. What I found particularly interesting about this one is we've seen a lot of views where sailors from the Kent with the censor marking from views on other postcards, but here's one actually on a Falkland Islands postcard Not in the best of shape, but when you find one of these, you don't particularly care about the condition. It was written on December 27th, 1914. I'm not sure if they were still in the Falklands at that time, but if they weren't, he obviously acquired this card there, and they had just recently left. Next slide, please. Another example of something from the war years, a little much more distant from the Falkland Islands. Some of you may remember this from a few years back, an article that I submitted to the Upland Goose, but it's an incoming postcard from a German prisoner of war in a Japanese POW camp. And he was written it to, I'm assuming, a relative, perhaps an uncle, named Willie Peterson, who was at the time working at Douglas Station in the Falklands. And again, in the archives, I looked, they talk about prisoners of war in one of the sections. And Willie Peterson was there. It showed him as a citizen of German descent, but he was obviously one who they figured was just fine because it said he was not detained. And on the right, this was my teaser card that I mentioned a bit ago, that for those of you that recall that comment. It's a card written by a fellow named C.J. Mesh. And the text says, "Prisoner of war here, expect ship to be released soon." And really, for the answer of this, look to this latest issue of the Upland Goose. Those of you who have seen the online edition and have read it will see that I've written an article about this postcard and another written by C.J. Mesh. And those of you who have just received your goose, I think I saw somebody hold theirs up. I hope you find the article enjoyable. And that's all I'm going to say about this one. Next slide, please, Mike. Moving into the post-war and the centenary years. The postcard on the left, a view of the Great Britain. And I wish all of you a great happy time in September. Those of you that are going to be at the study group weekend and touring and lunching at on the Great Britain. It should be a wonderful day, and I hope your weather's good. This particular card I'm particularly proud of because it's one of the few cards I actually found in Seattle. It was mailed to Seattle. I found it at a local stamp show here. And what I really like about it is it's got a great example of the small T for indicating postage due. And indeed, the postage due stamp was applied as well. To the right, I've showed two cards of another really nice series of cards of the British Empire exhibition in 1924, two views from the Falkland Islands court. And I was wondering, and perhaps when we talk about questions and comments at the end of the presentation, somebody can answer. I wonder if citizens from the Falkland Islands got to man the court, or if they were perhaps people living in Great Britain, England, perhaps people who worked for the Falkland Islands Company. I would hope that some people from the Falklands got to come over. Next slide, please. A couple more cards from the post-war and centenary years. The card on the left is a multi-view card. It's really hard to make out those little small images. The card was produced by T&N Binney, who produced a lot of postcards, were one of the more prolific Falklands postcard publishers. I only wish that they had produced a centenary set, a postcard of all of those views. Wouldn't that have made a nice, nice collector's item? But apparently they did not. And the card on the right, I found this card, I think of just a couple of years ago. The Binney Kelvin store and the Hardy Kelper store. The Hardys, R&A Hardy, were also keen publishers of postcards. And I find it very interesting that the two cards were literally across the street from one another. The two shops and their postcards. I hope it was friendly competition. We can hope so. Next slide, please, Mike. Couple of other cards, again, what I call the post-war and centenary years. On the left, whalebone arch. It's a photo postcard. It's a view that is very similar to some published postcards, but it's got slight differences. Reason I include this, and I think you'd find it quite interesting, is that I believe the card was actually, it's not been posted, but it was annotated on the back. I believe it was written by George Roberts. And he states on there that I erected this arch in 1933 as a centenary memorial. And he goes on to tell how big the whale bones are. And he certainly did erect the arch. So I can only guess that it was indeed George Roberts, who really was one of the most important people to the infrastructure of the Falkland Islands. He had much to do with the roads and just every mode of transportation and power, electricity, you name it, he was involved in it. A great contributor to the Falkland Islands. The view on the right, I included this is another card I had a question about. It's a series of cards. I've got several myself, a couple with views of the Reina del Pacifico, which was a Pacific line ship that was worked out of South America, and it was generally in the late 30s, early 40s. The card starts off with RD and a number. And I believe Kim has answered my query for me. He has a number of cards, and his theory is that they were published by and for the use on the ship, the Reina del Pacifico. I think he's right on that. I don't know how this escaped Henry Hayburn's keen eyes back then, but these cards seem to have only started showing up in the last maybe 8 to 10 years. Next slide, please, Mike. Moving into what I call the homemade postcards. Some of these can have some very interesting views. This first card on the left shows as it said on the back, the Ford lorry. And I believe that's the West Store, the back side of the West Store, and sitting on one of the fenders in the suit is, I believe, Bill Carey, who was the manager of the store, brother of famous postmistress Maud Carey. And the card was written by someone, it says by Jack. I don't know who that is. Would love to have found that out. And the card on the right, it's been annotated on the back that it was a lorry trip to Darwin. It was dated 1930. And it quotes in a rather humorous way, they had some rather funny places to get through. And I think this is pretty evocative of what the travel outside of Stanley was like for many of those that needed to get to the camp or move about in the camp. You'll note that I don't know how those tires stay on there. They must have had quite a set of springs on them. But apparently they got out okay. Next slide, please. Several more of these homemade type cards. On the left, upper left, hauling wool. I particularly like this card. A horse-drawn wagon loaded with bales of hay with about 6 or 7 young men to older men, all ages when you look at it more closely. They're obviously to unload the wool when they get to their point. And on the back, it's stated that they travel 4.5 miles over roadless country to deliver the wool to the shipping station. I don't know if this is on West Falkland or East, but it's an interesting view. Again, on the upper right, pretty common scene for Falklands. There's been several postcards that I've seen of cutting and handling of the peat, which was a common use of fuel in those days. And there certainly was time for leisure, as we can see in the bottom slide. This is a slide that was, or a postcard that was done in 1929. On the slate in front, it says it's the broadcasting staff and artiste ball in 1929. And I just wondered, how large can the broadcasting staff be in 1929? There must be a lot of friends and relatives there as well. And certainly a lot of musicians down in the front row. Next slide, please. Cannot talk about homemade postcards without showing a couple of the pen and ink drawings from Carl Lellman. He did a number of these, all typically in the 40s. They're almost always showing, when they're found, they're almost always showing dependency stamps. Here we see the HMS William Scoresby, and someone hopefully can help me with this one afterwards. I'm only guessing that it may be the Stonington Island Base E. I did a lot of looking at bases online to see if I could identify that photo and match it to a date, and that's about the closest I could come that it was possibly Stonington Island. So somebody who studied the dependencies and the bases much more than me might be able to answer that. Next slide, please, Mike. Moving into the West Falkland and New Island area, a card on the left from that early series that we've seen that was in Henry Hayburn's book, a view of Port Stevens settlement. But the card I really wanted to show off today was the card on the right, actually written from Port Stevens Station by Lucy Henna. The Henna family, I believe, owned or ran the Port Stevens Station. And here she's sending a postcard to Australia. And if you'll notice the date, it's written on 1108, January 1st, 1908. And it was not postmarked in Stanley until the 27th of 1908. That long, I guess, to get to Stanley. I did note that in the archives, the coastal steamer Gwendolyn arrived from Fox Bay on January 26th, and Pacific Line steamer left Stanley with the mails on the 28th. I could be most certain, I would think, that the Gwendolyn carried this card from Fox Bay. How long it took to get from Port Stevens to Fox Bay for pickup, I'm not sure. Or perhaps it was picked up off Port Stevens, I'm just not sure. Next slide, please. Another view of West Falkland, a card that is just simply written on the back, to Fox Bay for the mail. And this was written in 1938. It says photo by F. Lellman. So it must have been a relative of Carl Lellman. But it shows, again, and most of those horses, there's only 2 people on horseback. So all the rest of the horses are being taken to bring back all of the bags of mail and packages and various things that will have arrived on the ship. And here's a postcard that's inward mail to Fox Bay. We've seen some articles in the past about Dr. Henry and Miss Henry at Fox Bay. This is actually quite a recent acquisition. I was fortunate to find this. It was located in Canada, actually. And what I found particularly interesting, and maybe it's not of interest at all, I had not seen before, a receiver cancel applied in Stanley, and then again a receiver cancel or applied the Fox Bay cancel on arrival in Fox Bay. I thought that was quite interesting, and I appreciated that quite a bit. I don't know if it's as uncommon as I think it might be, but I'm rather fond of it. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you, Mike. This is my oops postcard. The view on the right is correct. The view on the right, the view on the right, you may notice I have the Dr. Henry card again. And it was supposed to be the back of the Grib postcard. But first of all, a photo of the Grib, a whale catcher off of New Island. This card was mailed actually from Stanley, not New Island. So the fact that I've put the wrong view of the card on the reverse does not upset me that much. Had it been posted in New Ireland, I'd have been more troubled that it wasn't available for you to see. But the Grib was one of the very early whaling ships to work out of New Ireland. It, along with the Admiralin and the Houken, I believe, were the first to open whaling in New Ireland. This card was written by Harry Townsend, quite an interesting fellow. Bob Barnes, quite a few years ago, published a series of things in the Upland Goose called People in the Post. And he had an interesting article about Harry Townsend. Townsend also was on the Oravia when she sank and wrote quite a stirring account of the wreck and rescue. Next slide, please. Moving into the whaling industry, a couple of postcards to show today. One, a postcard written by Edward Binney from South Georgia. He was the magistrate and postmaster there for a number of years. This card, interesting, is one of a series from showing the South Shetlands. And on the back of the card, he states that I do not have any postcards of South Georgia at present. Here's one that I do have. And as a good aid to his brothers, he points out that they can write, the sender or the receiver can write to TNN, Binney, and Stanley if they would like to get some postcards of South Georgia. I thought that was great. Pretty early, 1915 postcard out of South Georgia. The card on the right, a whaling view from 1930. The whalers flensing a whale at the side of the ship. I don't know if that's a factory ship or a whaler, probably a factory ship, but I'm not sure. What struck me on this, a little less common, it's handwritten, the address is Stromness, so Stromness Harbor, which you don't see as often as some of the other bases. Next card, please, or slide. Really interesting card. I'm still working on the research on this card, but a card written from the South Shetlands by a crew member or a person on board the Hectoria 2, a card showing Hector's Land Station, a series that's illustrated in Hayburn's books. Part of the quote on the back, this is what really makes this card of interest to me. Tomorrow the Fleurus is coming with mail and gets mail in return. I am fine here on the Hectoria, which is lying in Port Foster. I thank Eric Enerson in Norway for the translation of this postcard. And I've come to realize in researching this card, certainly the Fleurus we know carried the mails back and forth from South Georgia and side trips to the South Shetlands. But I also think in looking at the dates that this is the Hectoria 2 when she was there with Hubert Wilkins. And they brought the airplanes that he was using for his aerial expedition at the time. And I believe that they were lying in the harbor in Port Foster for his aerial expedition. I haven't quite confirmed that yet, but I think I may be right. Quite an interesting card. Next slide, please. Moving into Antarctic expeditions, I've shown several today, and with a little different flair on this one. First of all, from the Nordenskjöld expedition, the Swedish South Polar expedition, a card to Otto Nordenskjöld, sent to him in Stockholm shortly after his return. The card is a view, a little bit faded, but a view of the Tayuca, I think is the way it's pronounced, Hamburg South American line steamer that carried he and the crew back home. And the card was written by Helena Rogberg. She was the wife of the Swedish consul in Montevideo. Card was sent from Montevideo in early 1904. Card on the right is an Argentine produced card, and boy, they certainly played up the rescue and the expedition itself with a number of cards. This is a view of the Antarctic in the ice. There's a lot of these views, and this is just one of them. Next slide, please, Mike. Continuing with a bit of an Argentine connection on this expedition, the card on the right shows Jose Sobral. He was actually a member of the expedition team, the only Argentine member. Next to him, General Mitra, a former president of the Argentine Republic. I believe he was also the founder of the newspaper La Nacion, who published this card and the one on the previous slide. And that newspaper, I believe, is still in existence today. The middle card shows a postcard of the crew of the Uruguay, the ship that we all know rescued Nordenskjöld and the crew. And the card on the right, an artist depiction of Irizar, the captain of the Uruguay, the commander of the Uruguay. Next, please, Mike. Another Antarctic expedition, the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition. Boy, one of my favorite cards. Still working on research on this, but the card actually sent from one of the members of the crew, a card from William Murray, who was the second cook. I believe near the end of the expedition, he was promoted to the first cook when the first cook, I believe, stayed on the South Orkneys with the other person and the Argentine relief crew, I think. But he says on the card, this is the Scotia in our winter quarters at the Orkneys, and that we're sailing today from Port Stanley, mailed from Stanley on February 8th, 1904. Love the card. The card was published by the director of the Museo La Plata, Argentine Museum, when they were getting refitted for their journey back to the Falklands and then homeward bound. And he produced the card for use by those on board the ship. So I threw a card in there showing a view of the museum. Next slide, please. A couple of more things from the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition. The card on the right is actually a modern produced card. I've never seen this view. It must have been from one of the original photos or slides. Card produced by Harvey Peary. Marjorie told me years ago that it was probably a card that he had produced for distribution at his speaking engagements in later years. Apparently, he spent quite a bit of his post-expedition years in later life touring, talking about the expedition, and no doubt handed out some of these cards. On the right, two views, Argentine produced cards of the South Orkneys and the expedition. These photos were taken by the relief crew of Argentines and the two, I believe the two Scottish members of the team that stayed. The first, not a postally used card, shows Omond House that they built and stayed in during the time there. The second card was actually mailed from Stanley in 1906. It's got a Great Britain Edward VII stamp on it. It's mailed from Stanley. And I was fortunate enough to get a translation from Hugo Castillo, who I met in Portland, Oregon in 2007 when I gave a short presentation on postcards. But the card says, souvenir from these places where I stayed during 14 months in the observatory, which is on the island. He obviously was a member of one of the relief crews. I haven't been able to place or find anyone who might know. I cannot make out the person's name. I don't think he was a member of the first relief crew, but perhaps the second relief crew. So I found that rather interesting as well. Next slide, please, Mike. Just one slide on the German South Polar expedition. And I guess my message on this one is to always keep your eyes open and ask questions. These two postcards, two different views of the Deutschland, the ship that was used for the expedition. One, a German-produced card, and the one on the right, Argentine produced by Jacobo Puser, a prolific publisher of postcards in Argentina. But what caught my eye, and it was an online auction, and only the front of the card was shown. And I asked if I could get a photo of the back. And lo and behold, there was the the label of the expedition with one of the scarce 3-line expedition cachets. The card wasn't postally used, but I was happy as a clam anyway to receive a 3-line expedition cachet. And so I guess I would always say, if you can't see the back of the card and you're curious, ask. It may be rewarding. Next slide, please. The mail steamers, as I said in my opening comments, what could we do without them? Here, a pretty common view of the one of the artist view of one of the Cosmos steamers in the Straits of Magellan. The Cosmos line, as most of you all know, that held the first contract with the islands from 1880 to 1900 and provided really an excellent service during those 20 years. On the right, I've included a bit of ephemera, a fare plan document showing the schedule of schedule for July through December, the latter half of 1890. And what attracted me to this card, I've always liked this card. It's on the cover of Jeremy Howitt's fine book, The Cosmos Years. Next slide, please. A couple of other postcards showing ships from the Cosmos line. The card on the left, a Theban. You don't see many cards from this line, particularly ones like this. You do see a few cards that were published for use on the ships. The Theban here, a German-produced card on a card that was mailed in 1899 from Hamburg to Valparaiso. The card on the right, I've seen a series of this type of postcard showing different shipping line ships along with their house flags. And here I was fortunate enough to find one of the Memphis. I believe the card was used in 1903, which would have made it the correct Memphis. And they're a fine example of the house flag of the Cosmos line. And the next slide, please, Mike. The Pacific Steam Navigation Company, again, they took over the contract in 1900. It lasted till 1914, the outbreak of the war, but certainly the Pacific Line continued to bring the mails to and from the Falklands after that time, but just not on quite as regular of a basis. Again, a bit of ephemera on the right, a map from one of the passenger lists that I was able to acquire over the years showing the routes. And here a card, we are in view of the Falklands, written on Christmas Day. The card was posted with a 1 penny Queen Victoria lilac stamp, a common stamp, posted in the Falklands on the 27th of December. So they put ashore just shortly after Christmas. And next slide, please. Two more views of Pacific Line. On the left, one of the lesser seen ships, the black and white view of the Orita, used in Stanley in 1904, and departed and arrived right on the 26th of October and left 1 day later for Punta Arenas. And I should thank Ken Burley here for his fine work with monographs on the Pacific Line. It certainly set me to hunting for all of the cards that I could find. And here's one on the right, one of the more scarce Spanish version cards. Postally used, not from the Falklands. I've not seen one that was used in the Falklands. Perhaps some of you have. This card was used from Coronel to Valparaiso. And next, and I believe last slide, Mike. What can a presentation of postcards of the Falkland Islands be without a view of penguins? And with that, I want to thank everybody for allowing me to give this presentation today. And I'd like to open it up to questions and comments. And Mike and Kim, thanks so much for your help and support in putting this together.